Welcome to Football Geeks. Tonight's guest is a fellow who originates from the Mediterranean island of Malta. His present book, Echoes of an Italian Summer, recounts stories from Italia 1990, using the tournament as a kind of flexible base camp and not its central anchor. To talk about this fabulous book in more depth, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Paul Grech. Good evening, Paul. How are you?
Good evening. I'm very, very well, and thanks for inviting me here.
Oh, it's a pleasure, mate. We spoke before we came on air, and the book it's terrific because it doesn't adhere to the usual World Cup book template in the sense that it tells stories that kind of predate and postdate Italia 90, but while still using it as the kind of focal point that like the Italia 90 is like the main city, and your stories are the little A roads and villages off the beaten track. So it's really a refreshing read, mate.
Well, what can I say to an introduction like that? Thanks for the kind words. In truth, I'm conscious that there are quite at least a couple of other books which focus on Italian 90, which do it brilliantly. So whatever I wrote, I would never match with, for example, Dating It's All Over, which is sort of I think one of the best books about any World Cup. So I decided I wanted to write something with a little bit different, but about a tournament which was pivotal for me. So I was 14 at the time of Italia 90. So and it was the first major football tournament or World Cup that I really remember sort of as having a real football fan. So I was really following the game. I was as passionate about the game as only a teenager can be about a sport, and I had all the free time in the world, so I could watch all the games. I could read everything about it. I could follow everything on TV about the World Cup. So for me, it was a foundational World Cup. But when I was thinking about it, it was foundational even for the sport itself. So, and these are all items that I touched upon in the book. The way fans were treated, it was coupled with other factors, a turning point. The fact that football became popular again once more. It was, in hindsight, quite a poor tournament football-wise, and it led to certain changes which echo till this day. So the fact that we have such football which is played on the ground has a lot of its roots back into that World Cup, and when FIFA ultimately decided that something needed to be done to remove the negativity from the game. Those were the kind of stories that I wanted to tell. But apart from that, I wanted to tell human stories. So these are always the kind of stories that I seem to be attracted to. So both as a reader and also as a writer, these are the kind of stories that really excite me and really motivate me to write something. And that is ultimately what led to the book, that desire to tell these kind of stories, which hopefully not everyone will know, or at least know all of them.
Yeah, it's funny you should. I mean, it is definitely a book with a difference. It has got those kind of stories in it, but it's funny you should mention the age of 14 as the kind of and the passion of a teenager watching football, because at least two other people I've had on guests on the show have said that 14 is the optimum age for the football fan. It's when you love your club the most. It's when you love football the most, and it's when you are the most passionate. And either side of that, it's just it goes in the different directions. You know.
Well, I guess there are so many chemicals going through your mind.
Of course,
Let's say the natural chemicals, not when you're growing. But even music, the music which really sticks with you tends to be the ones when you are between 14 and 20. So that is the best kind. So everyone thinks that that's the greatest music ever, the ones that they grew up with. And this is because even your brain is growing so much that and it's making so many different connections that these kind of things really get embedded. I'm sure that someone somewhere has done um, research about this, but to me, I'm not surprised by you telling me that because, as I said, it's the same with music. Maybe movies not so much, but even when you think about television, for example, everyone thinks that the golden era of television is the one where they grew up watching between those years. So it's
Yeah,
quite natural, I think.
that's right. Nostalgia can do funny things to the mind, can't it? Sometimes, man.
Speaking of nostalgia, for example, I spoke to the designer of the German kit, the West Germany kit at the
Yeah,
time, which is quite today. It's quite an iconic, and it's still one of the biggest sellers as far as kits go. But she told me that at the time people didn't really like it. It was only
yeah,
afterwards that it became such a cult phenomenon, and people started talking to her, and everyone inviting her for interviews and to attend conferences. So nostalgia does tricks on us.
yeah. It was thought to be quite a simplistic template, wasn't it? Anyway, Paul, you're a native of Malta. So where did you get into like football? What I mean, and is there a kind of local fix where you go and watch your football, or is it a kind of European thing for you where you watch the TV? Or
Yes, so Malta is quite a funny place when it comes to football. So um, we obviously have our national team, but we're I think most people are disappointed by the results that the Maltese national team gets, but we're realistic that knowing that it's very hard for us to qualify for any or come even close to qualifying for any major tournament. So everyone has their favorite foreign national team. So and Malta was ruled for centuries by the British. So there are a lot of people who support the British, and a lot of local teams are quite heavily influenced by the British influence, the British presence on the island. So Floriana, who were one of the biggest and best teams early on, they were till this day white and green stripes, and they were called the Irish. So it's obvious sort of where their influence came from. So there's quite a huge British influence, but Malta is also very close to Italy. So the island is split half and half um, between those who support English clubs and the English national team and the Italian national team.
okay,
And when if you come to Malta during the World Cup, in the World Cup, you will see loads of houses with either the British flag, the flag of St. George on the roofs, or the Italian ones. In recent years, you're spotting a few more of Brazil and Germany, but I would still say it's the English and the Italians who are prevalent. And then and obviously people then follow the English side. Maltese football is followed, but it's not as huge as the following, which is for English sides. I happen to be a Liverpool fan, and that's
no,
because my father, I was sick one day. My father brought a magazine home, it's Match magazine, and I said, "Who's on top of the table?" I think it was Southampton. It was still early in the season. I said, "I don't like the sound of that one," and Liverpool were second, and I plumped for them. And then, obviously, at the time there was John Barnes, and he caught my imagination, and I've been a fan ever since. So in 1990, I was following. So at the time, I was really uh, hopeful to see what Barnes would do, what Beasley would do at the World Cup. In truth, neither of them had a particularly impressive tournament, and Barnes in particular wasn't ever really impressive for the English national side, and there was a whole debate at the time about it. But
yeah,
like many other kids, sort of if I followed an English side, I plumped for the English national team. So maybe that's another reason why that World Cup is still so ingrained in my memory. Because England did obviously quite well. It was to an extent a surprising run to the semi-finals. It was a heartbreaking way of being eliminated in the tournament from the tournament, but it was also a way which made you laugh those players even more because they gave it their all and they were unlucky to an extent to be eliminated. On the flip side, a lot of people were happy that at least if England didn't make it to the final, Italy didn't as well. So that is the sort of
the balancing act between the two. So I asked you to sort of talk in detail about 3 of the chapters in this book, and the first chapter that you plump for is actually the first chapter in the book, and it starts with the lines, "Those wild, crazy eyes," which, of course, for anyone who watched that tournament would know immediately that you're referring to Salvatore Schillaci, who was the kind of nascent forward who over about the last 12 months had started scoring regularly in Serie A. But the first chapter, although it touches on the Salvatore Schillaci story, it isn't about Salvatore Schillaci. It's about the other Schillaci, isn't it, Paul?
Exactly. So, in a way, this was the chapter which kick-started the whole idea. So, Toto Schillaci, he was one of the 2 main stars of the Italian national team. There were 2 surprise stars, so it was Schillaci and Roberto Baggio. Neither was expected to play a huge role in Italy's World Cup. The manager at the time, Azeglio Vicini, wasn't really one for experimenting. He had only included Schillaci in the last minute and played him. But out of desperation, he threw him on, and Schillaci sort of had the tournament of his life, almost literally, because after that tournament, he never really came close to hitting those same peaks. But for that tournament, he became the star, the pride of the nation. But what really hit me was that there could have been another Schillaci playing in that team, and this was Maurizio Schillaci. It was his cousin. He played in some of the same teams that Schillaci played in. He had one great manager who was coming out of Sicilian football, which was Zdenek Zeman, who made his early days coaching youth football in Sicily and then getting coaching teams over there. And he considered Maurizio a better player than Toto, actually. So, and when Zeman says something like that about a forward, you know that there must have been something special about him. But what really hit me is that Toto Schillaci, on one hand, he had the same beginnings, and he became the hero of the nation. He is, to this day, a hero to most Italians. So when he took place in I'm a Celebrity, he came in 2nd or 3rd, so he's still quite a beloved figure. He did quite well. Even he has his football schools these days. He has his businesses, so he's done quite well out of his fame. And on the flip side, there is Maurizio, who had maybe the same talent and the same beginnings, but ended up living in a car. And to me, sort of those 2 extremes, they're fascinating, and to see why would someone end up this way and someone else end up completely different. And it's all down to small things and these almost sliding doors moment. What happened is essentially that I don't want to give too much of the story away. Maurizio effectively had an injury when it should have been after his biggest move in his career, when he was he joined the biggest club, which should have really launched him in the national scene. He had an injury. Uh, he ended up spending a lot of his time partying, and from then to illicit substances, and the whole road downhill from there. But
Yeah.
I didn't really want to dwell on how he ended there. It was more this sort of quirky twist of fate that one player ended up uh, in the playing for Italy and becoming a hero, and the other one ended up as a forgotten by almost all of his teams, except a few people who saw him play, and his coach Zen Examen, who even not recently, but not too far back, he mentioned him in a newspaper when he was talking about players he had coached. So, and those are the kind of stories which I love, sort of these maybe forgotten pieces, which highlight more than simply the game of football, but they touch upon life and how fate can have a twist to send someone in a different path than someone else.
Of course, in the Italian press, they wrote an interesting piece, and they called the story of Maurizio Schillaci a descending parable, whereas Toto's was the rags to riches story. Maurizio's was the riches to rags story. As such. But I spoke to somebody about a professional footballer recently, and about how, because it's such a kind of errant lifestyle, and you're so looked after, and you're so kind of you remain a child until you retire from football, because you at the top level, because the club looks after you. But what it doesn't do, modern football, it doesn't tend to kind of be able to control a certain lifestyle either, and there needs to be kind of more aftercare for players, I think.
Yeah. It's still not great today, but it was even worse back then. So players were heroes, where they were the focal point. So, and you would find a lot of enablers. So if you were playing for a big side, you would have a lot of people inviting you to parties, hanging on to you, and there wasn't the constant media around players as there is today. So another player who excelled in that World Cup, Diego Maradona, he had quite a lively lifestyle, and I cannot imagine someone like Cristiano Ronaldo or Lionel Messi having his same attitude and going out dancing and coming late into training. It's simply not possible these days, because someone will film you, someone will photograph you, and it will be splashed all over within seconds of you.
Yeah.
So back then, players had the ability to actually do what they liked, even though coaches tried to control them as much as possible. And
Yeah.
and this meant a lot of things. One thing it meant that they used to spend a lot of their money, which wasn't, they didn't have the riches of today. They spent a lot of their money partying and on dorm friends. So they ended up at the end of their career quite not poor, but not as rich as maybe they could have been, or well off as they could have been. And secondly, that they had this very different sense of reality, where it's not as if you're a normal person. It's people are sort of inflating your ego by how they react to you, and then ultimately, once you're no longer a player, it all changes, and you have to face that reality. And it's not easy having moving from that adulation to suddenly that the obscurity. And I can imagine how hard it must be for them to handle things.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because the first chapter you've profiled is all about the kind of about the inhumanity of what happened to this guy, whereas the second chapter, where you talk about how the World Cup changed football, isn't about the aesthetics of football. It's actually about the human fundamentals of football, isn't it? Would you like to go into detail about that for us, Paul?
So maybe I'm attributing things to Italianity, which aren't there, but for me,
I
it's
think there's definitely a link here, mate. I think
yeah.
that, and it has been it's a link that I've put together as well. So I think you're quite right in making this link. But you talk us through it, mate.
So there were, it changed football in two ways. One in the aesthetic of how it's played and so on, but also in how fans are treated. In Italy, so Italy at the time in 1990, the Italian mindset when it comes to English fans, it was basically governed by two experiences. The first one was in 1980. Italy had hosted the European Championships. England had played there. Fans had created quite some problems, and the Italian media sort of remembered that, and even a lot of people in Italy remembered the trouble that had been caused, and the threats by local authorities of cancelling the tournament because they didn't want the fans to come to their cities and cause trouble. So there was already that attitude towards English fans. And then obviously there was Heysel, which was a terrible disaster. There were a lot of factors there, but the main one was the Liverpool fans who made a move to attack the Italians, and then the stadium wasn't really up to it, and then it ended with the tragedy with 39 people dead. And obviously for Italy, it was quite a shock to see so many people going to a football match and not coming back. And for them, from that point on, even from earlier, but that really cemented the attitude that English fans are all hooligans. So even to this day, Italian media sometimes refer to the English fans as hooligans, even though maybe the negative aspect is less there today. There's still that attitude that every English fan is going there to drink beer, to get smashed and to cause trouble. So in 1990, there was quite this attitude towards English fans. It wasn't just from the Italian media or the Italian organizing committee, even at home. Both the Conservatives and the Labour parties, they kind of agreed that if possible, England should not be either not allowed to compete, or else strict measures should be taken to discipline fans who cause trouble. So from all sides of the political spectrum, fans were seen as the enemy. And this attitude was even reflected in the stadia at the time. So most stadia were run down, the people were being penned in, which resulted in some terrible tragedies. I think the major one being the Hillsborough tragedy, and still people kept blaming always the fans. And we saw that in the aftermath of Hillsborough, where fans were blamed for something that they had no control over. But this was quite simply the attitude at the time. It was always the fans who were to blame for anything which went wrong. And there were even attempts to, as I said, to stop England from taking part. The ultimate solution, was putting England to play all their games in Sardinia. Why? Because it was harder to get to. There was only one airport, which was not up to handling the mass of fans who were coming in, and even the Irish fans, for example, who were in the same tournament. most of whom opted not to stay in Sardinia, and actually a lot of fans stayed in Malta. So I remember that quite clearly. And the ultimate aim was, let's control how many people can get to the island, how many who comes into the island, and maybe the fact that you have to get on a plane, it will discourage some of the supporters. English fans were, again, those who made it were treated as, to an extent, criminals, regardless of what they did and what they didn't do. But thankfully, there was also the seeds which would blossom in later years in changes in attitude. So the Football Supporters Association had been set up a couple of years earlier, and they were the ones who really made the first move to change supporters' attitudes, but also how they reacted to these situations. They started educating the fans that, listen, if you're held, don't try to fight, just stay as calm as possible. These are the numbers to call, these are the embassies, and they started to tell people what they should do in case they were detained, which was quite normal for fans to actually be detained simply for being English fans. And attitudes, people's, the way that fans reacted started to change. First of all, because obviously not all fans who went to the stadium went there to cause problems. The majority went then just to watch football, just to watch their national team. But also because there was this calming influence which started having a root, getting a root in the mentality. And obviously there was the great contributing factor that England did quite well. So the better the team did, the better fans' reaction was, and the more happy people were. And by the end of the tournament, so we started the tournament with police threatening, saying that anyone who was going to break the rules was going to be harshly treated. There were some running battles between some Sardinian locals and the English fans that they perceived as being trying to cause troubles, which was celebrated almost like a football victory in the Italian media. Till then, we have the end of the tournament where England played Italy, which would have in other circumstances been a real headache, but ended with both sets of fans almost celebrating together. Obviously, it wasn't really a very dramatic game because it was the third and fourth place playoff, but it showed how people's attitude had changed, and it was changing even more back home. So there was the Taylor report, which had just come out, and which laid the blame on the stadia, and it said if you treat fans like animals, they will act like animals, and the drive to improve stadia actually resulted in English football as it is today, which is at the envy to an extent of all of the major European football leagues, and it is for both positive and negative, it is a huge success, which no one would have imagined back in 1990, but because of what England managed to do, because of the newly found love for the game, and people started seeing in the game something that they could get behind. Because of the stadia that they were being renovated, it also led to a new generation of chairmen who spotted an opportunity. They saw what was happening in the US, where there were much richer TV deals, and said, why can't we have that? If we're having better stadia, fans are behaving, why can't we have more of that? And ultimately it resulted with the Premier League, which, love it or hate it, it's undeniable that it's a huge success. And I don't think there's any league in the world which matches up as much as it does with England.
No, and from small acorns, mate, because it looked pretty bleak at the start of Italia 1990. As you say, there wasn't there wasn't much optimism going into that tournament. And in regard to Stadio, you talk about Hillsborough. I think every fan of the day recalls a moment when you're on the terraces and there was a moment of panic where you thought, hang on, this is a bit, this is getting a bit kind of scary now. And it happened throughout grounds, throughout Britain, and it was a symptom of this perception that football fans were animals, whereas we weren't. I mean, when Heysel happened, I was a 19-year-old kid who'd been going to watch football games since he was 7, and just enjoyed going to watch football games, and that's what 95% of football fans were. But anyway, that's my thought.
Well, when you think about something like the Bradford fire, which is another huge tragedy, which sadly has been, I wouldn't say forgotten, at least certainly not by the people of Bradford, but maybe in the wider mindset, it's not as prevalent as what happened in Hillsborough. But when you think about what caused that fire and the fact that people died because someone said, okay, that's rubbish, it can stay there, why bother spending money cleaning it up? It's mind blowing to be honest, and it's really sad that that accident, that tragedy, didn't bring about the change that it should have done. And it took another tragedy to start solving or fixing some of those other things.
As you say, it all became part of a political agenda, didn't it? And that's the saddest part, because we all know that politics and sport are linked, but we like to think that they're not. Anyway, moving on, we're going to go onto the third chapter that you chose to speak about, which is the soundtrack of the World Cup, because there was some pretty decent music that soundtracked it. I could mention a few, but I'm going to let you mention them because I've got my own personal favourites. But would you like to talk us through the story of the soundtrack of Italia 1990, Paul?
So earlier we were saying how Italia 90 changed English football, even from the way fans were treated and so on. It also, the fact that the music, which is associated with Italia 90, it's also symptomatic of the change in attitude which would come afterwards. So there are three key songs which are linked to it. The first one is Nessun Dorma, which it was made popular. So this, for me, it was quite something I learned as I grew older. For me, the Nessun Dorma soundtrack, it was because Luciano Pavarotti, he sang at the opening ceremony, and there had been a concert on the eve of the opening ceremony, which had been screened on the TV. That, for me, was where my experience with Nessun Dorma ended. But I realized that for most people in the UK, they actually watched on the BBC, and that was used as the soundtrack to the opening of the show. So a lot of people associated the Nessun Dorma with that World Cup, and to an extent, there's a little bit of irony in that, and that at the time, football fans, they were, as we just said, they were considered as being not only working class, but even the lowest sort of intellectually, and how they were treated as they were treated quite shabbily, and they were not seen as being culturally sort of sophisticated. And when I was researching the book and then speaking about Nessun Dorma, I found that there were a lot of people who scoffed at the idea that Luciano Pavarotti was singing Nessun Dorma to these huge crowds, which the tenors eventually started messing and making something like opera music accessible to the masses. And there were a lot of people who were involved in the scene who said it's shameful what they're doing, sort of picking only these parts and making them sort of not popular because it was popular, but it was sort of debasing classical music, which again it sort of echoes an attitude that there was towards football. And Pavarotti himself was quite a football fan, so all of this sort of it's strange sometimes when you start touching on a subject how many different sort of new aspects pop up which linked to other things. So Nessun Dorma was the first song. Then there was so in Malta, as I said, what was much more popular at the time was the Notte Magiche song by Gianna Nannini, which sort of what was the official song of the tournament, and it's quite catching. It was quite a catchy tune. So and that is the song which really I would say was prevalent over here, and that too had quite an interesting story in that. One of the musicians, Eduardo Bernardo, he was a folk singer, and a lot of people again held it against him because he was abandoning his folk principles to sing a popular music. And I came quite an interesting story in that he was a huge Napoli fan, and he was preparing to sing on the opening game of the tournament, and he saw Diego Maradona, who he obviously idolized, coming towards him, and he said, "Oh, sort of, Maradona is going to talk to me." And then all that Maradona wanted was for Eduardo Bernardo to introduce him to his co-singer Gianna Nannini, because obviously he wanted to meet her as well. So that's one of the sort of humorous stories which I found, which I love thinking about, because it captures a lot of what Maradona was off the pitch, and that has remained, and for me something which sort of echoed to an extent for the Italians. That was a shame in Italy that people didn't want to listen to it because they were so disappointed by the result of what they achieved in that World Cup. They expected to at least make it to the final. Most people expected Italy to win, at least most Italians expected Italy to win, and they ended up not winning. So the song, which so such ingrained in what Italy did, people thought they didn't want to hear it again, which all changed when there was the European Championships in 2021, and the Italian national team was someone on the team bus captured them singing it again, and sort of that was where the song really took off once more, and sort of Italy obviously won that tournament, and sort of it was freed from the curse of Italia 90. So it suddenly became cool, not cool, but it became accepted to sing it and be proud of that song. And it is something which I sort of really appreciated, that whole arc, which was that one. But for me, the best song of those three, it was the English one. So I'm quite a fan of New Order. So even the fact that they were there, it's a special. But it's a song about football, but which is not about football. When you look at the words of the song, it has such a universal appeal. But then you have these elements of football thrown in there. And it is essentially, for me, it's a good song. It's not a good football song. It's a good song, period. And it's a timeless song. So even if you hear it today, it's still a catchy tune. It's not dated like previous attempts by for official songs. So I think those three, they represented a different age for the game, and obviously eventually so with the decision to go for New Order, football was accepting that it was going for a popular band. And that is what football actually became eventually. So after 1990, it became a pop phenomenon.
Yeah, yeah.
And
So
to this day, footballers are as big stars, as musicians, as actors, and so on. And that for me was quite interesting. You mentioned that there were some good songs. I listened to some other songs, and I would not recommend it to anyone else because there were some really, really terrible, terrible songs. So
there
the
were, but
German one was a Schlager, so it's quite, but it's not even the worst. So the American one, it was terrible. It was
oh dear.
so I challenge anyone who wants to really listen to some bad music to find what the German song, the Dutch song from that tournament, they were really, really terrible, terrible choices.
There was a great. There was one by a band who lived just up the road from me when it came, and they were called Pop Will Eat Itself, and they released a song called "Touched by the Hand of Ciccolina," and it was really good, and you can still see it on YouTube. Have a look. It's quite a dancey one, but it was tied in with the Italia 1990 World Cup, although not in an official way. Although it was in the charts at the time of the Italian World Cup. But it's funny how you should say like the parallels between the soundtrack and the product of football. They became kind of sort of almost kind of interlinked, didn't they? And a lot of your book explores that. That kind of connection between football product and the parallels that run through that. But going into a little more, we're going to some interesting territory now. Who were the players that excited you the most at Italia United? Because you said before it wasn't a great tournament, but it had some iconic moments and it had some great players. So who stood out for you, Paul?
So I love watching the game, but I'm really, really terrible at football. So at the time, I was always either stuck playing in defense. I was one of those kids who was the last one chosen for the teams to play, and I was either stuck playing as a goalkeeper or as a defender. So I always lose to look out for that kind of player. So for me, Mark Wright, he had quite a unique tournament that because England were experimenting with the libero system, sort of with three at the back, and he was the chosen libero, and he had quite a tournament. And again, it changed the idea that English defenders couldn't be cultured. At the time, there was quite this whole debate that English defenders were only good at hacking at players and kicking the ball upfield. Mark Wright, I wouldn't say he was as cultured as some of the defenders we have today, but for the era he was quite a thinking player, and he used to and had an excellent tournament that year. So he was one who stayed with me. Obviously, there were a lot of goalkeepers, so I had a soft spot for Goicoechea, the Argentinian goalkeeper who was not meant even to be in the top three goalkeepers in the national squad. He came into the spotlight by accident, and he became a national hero. So again, it's one of those stories which I write about in the book, and which for me it's really something which I love. It's the kind of story which I love. So I looked at most at those kind of players. So even I remember for example, Cameroon. A lot of people looked at I think at Milla, but I remember that Cameroon had these two great keepers who were playing in France, and there was this whole rivalry between them, and one who sort of refused to play. So those were the players who I remembered most. My actual biggest hero at the time was Rinat Dasayev, who was the Soviet goalkeeper. I remember him from 2 years earlier in the European Championships, where he almost saved everything that was thrown at him until he met Gullit and Van Basten in the final. And I sort of he seemed this cool player who wasn't really bothered by anything. He could save anything, and for me, he was, in my mind, the keeper who could stop any shot. So for me, you were, at the time, you were to tell me pick one player, I would go for Rina Desailly, and that says a lot of me, and at the time, sort of what I liked in players. But I still quite like um, the defensive side of play. So if you tell me who is my favorite Liverpool player today, it would be Alisson, the goalkeeper. So that is my mindset. Obviously, I had a bit of soft spot for Claudio Caniggia as well, the Argentine striker.
Yeah.
I remember him playing in Italy with Atalanta at the time, and again he was in the shadow of Diego Maradona, but there's a lot of the dangerous work for him, sort of, and his runs when you examine how he plays, he opened up a lot of doors, and he took a lot of heavy tackles as well. And maybe the fact that he scored against Italy in the semi-final, that also colors a bit my judgment, because at the time it was a big thing, because he eliminated the Italians as well to an extent.
It's funny you should mention. I was a goalkeeper for many years. I played in goal for 20 years, and I actually saw Rene Desailly play at Villa Park in 1983 for Spartak Moscow, and they beat Villa. I wasn't a Villa fan, but I went with some friends, and they played tremendous football on the night, and they knocked Villa out 2-1, last minute winner. But I remember Desailly pulling off one of the most incredible saves I've ever seen. It was like a half volley from the edge of the box that was flying into the bottom left hand corner. He somehow got something on it and turned it wide. But your book there's a theme about goalkeepers in your book. I won't give too much away, because I want people to read it, but there's why 1990 was particularly good for Brazilian goalkeepers. There's a chapter that kind of embodies that, but there's also other great chapters about the re-emergence of Pelé. I won't go into too much detail there. I'll let people read about that. So it's a fantastic book, and I've thoroughly enjoyed reading it, mate. But where can you get this book? Can you tell everybody where it's available?
So it's available in all major bookshops, but there's also online from the Pitch Publishers website, who are the publishers of the book, and I think that's the best place where you can get it. And then there is the great the American conglomerate, sort of Amazon, which is where you can get anything these days, from books to shopping. So you can find it online anywhere where people normally get their books. And obviously, if people want to reach out to me and talk to me, I'm on Twitter or X, whatever it's called these days, at Paul_Grech. And anyone who wants to chat about Italia 90, or Italia 90 as I call it, because the Italian influences for me, it's still quite strong. And I would love to hear from people who read it, what they think and what they liked about the book.
Oh, Paul, well, thank you for being a wonderful guest, and thanks for adding flesh to the bones of our Italian 1990 adventure this evening. So thanks for that. And we'll see you next time for more football talk on Football Geeks. Thank you for joining in, everyone.
Thank you for the conversation.